All right, so your heading for these notes will be Chapter 2, Section 4. Here's some objectives for this section. These are some key terms. One definition I am going to ask you to write is framers, because that's an important word in this section. So you need to define and write down that framers are the individuals who attended the Philadelphia Convention. We will talk about these other definitions like the Virginia Plan, the New Jersey Plan, all these other plans that are defined here on these two slides. We'll talk about those in the actual notes. Here on the introduction, what compromises enabled the framers to create the Constitution? That was the answer to your focus question for today. So the Connecticut Compromise, the 3/5 Compromise, the Commerce and Slave Trade Compromise, any of those could have been answers for your focus question for today. So your first heading is going to be the framers. And what you need to know is that the Constitutional Convention was in 1787, and 55 delegates attended. Delegates is just a fancy word for representatives. So 55 representatives from the 13 states or colonies attended the Constitutional Convention. You do need to know that the framers came from many backgrounds. One important one is that many had fought in the Revolutionary War. 8, you can use the number 8, had signed the Declaration of Independence. We do not have to write it, but we're going to talk about it. 34 of the framers had attended college. Notice it says at a time when it was a rare achievement. During 1787, it was extremely rare to attend college or to attend a university. So 34 of the framers had attended colleges. So they would have been considered very high achieved and looked at as to be extremely smart. We're not going to write this entire last bullet, but what you do need to know is that 2 of the framers would become president of the United States, and that 1 would become a vice president. 19 would become U.S. senators, and 13 would become members of the House of Representatives. So a lot of the framers did go on after the Constitution was written to become popular politicians. So your next heading is a new government. The framers, so the people in attendance at the convention, elected George Washington as president of the convention, so not of the United States, but they elected him as president of this constitutional convention, and they also set up some procedural rules. Really, you just need to know, forget about procedural, you just need to know they set up some rules. So one of the rules is that a majority of state delegations or their representatives would need to be present to conduct business. So for them to have some sort of say in what's happening, the majority of their state representatives or state delegates would have to be there. Each delegation would have 1 vote, and a majority vote would carry a proposal, which really just means a majority vote would win, which is how our House of Representatives and Senate conduct business today. Majority wins, majority rules. We talked about that in Chapter 1. So no new heading, still talking about the new government. So what we need to know here is the framers made their biggest decision on May 30th. We're not going to write that down, but their biggest decision was to replace the Articles of Confederation rather than amend them, rather than change them. So instead of changing the Articles of Confederation, they made the decision they were going to have to replace it with something else. So this guy over here is James Madison. Talks about him being a major figure in the movement to replace the Articles of Confederation, to repeal them and replace them with something new, with something stronger, with something better. So your next heading is the Virginia Plan. What is the Virginia Plan? This is the definition, right? So this plan called for a government with a legislative, executive, and judicial branch. That sounds familiar. This is what we have today. We have a government with a legislative, which is Congress, executive, which is the president, and judicial, which is our court systems. So the Virginia Plan, that's what it called for. It wanted 3 separate branches of government. It said that Congress would have 2 houses, which is what we have today, the House of Representatives and the Senate. The Virginia Plan wanted representation based on state population or the money given to the central government. So your representation could be based on your state population or how much money your state gave to the federal government. This is what the plan, the Virginia Plan, this is what they were asking, or their plan that they were submitting to the delegates, to the framers, and to the other people in attendance at this constitutional Congress. So they also wanted Congress to have more power. So Congress would have more power than it had under the Articles of Confederation. It would be able to force states to obey federal laws. That's an important one because that was a big reason that the Articles of Confederation was failing, because Congress did not have any power. It also talks about that the members of Congress would elect a national executive and judiciary. So what that means is that Congress would elect the president and the courts, which now, that's not what happens now. But this was the Virginia Plan. So Congress, they said Congress would elect a national executive and judiciary. So what that simply means is that Congress would elect the president and judges. So the difference of what we do today is the people elect the president. The judiciary, or the judges, are confirmed by Congress. So these 2 branches would form a council that could veto acts passed by Congress. So they wanted veto. What you need to know here is that veto power was for Congress under the Virginia Plan. We know that veto power is the president or the executive branch's plan in our government today. So our next heading is the other plan that was submitted. So a bunch of the different states and delegates got together and created plans and submitted them. This is what their ideal government was. So the next one is the New Jersey Plan. This plan proposed a much different organization of the 3 branches. So they still wanted 3 branches, but it was a different organization of the 3 branches. They wanted Congress to just have one single house with equal representation for each state. Under this, it talks about the Congress would have more limited powers than the Virginia Plan. So Congress would have more limited powers. There would be executive committee of several people chosen by Congress. So instead of one executive like the president, there would be several on a committee, and these executives would be chosen by the members of Congress. Congress could remove members of the committee at the request of state governors. And then also, the other thing that you would want to know is that the executive committee would appoint a supreme tribunal to be the federal judiciary. So kind of like what we do today, the executive branch does appoint the Supreme Court justices, but this is different. They wanted a supreme tribunal to be the federal judiciary, and that this executive committee would elect them or nominate or appoint them. instead of just one person as we have today with the president appointing them and then the Congress confirms that person. All right, so our next heading is Connecticut Compromise. So under the Connecticut Compromise, because we know from our map tests that Connecticut's a very small state. So the small states feared that the larger states would dominate them under the Virginia Plan. They thought that the Virginia Plan was going to leave out the small states because it was based on your state's population. That's how you got representation in Congress. So they felt like these bigger states were going to take advantage of the smaller states. So you need to know that the Connecticut Compromise was also called the Great Compromise, and it solved this dispute. And instead of dispute, we're going to say problem. So it solved the problem of smaller states being dominated by the larger states. And the Connecticut Compromise, or the Great Compromise, the compromise they came up with is that the House of Representatives would be represented according to its population. So according to population of the state. And then in the Senate, in the second house of Congress, each state would have equal representation. This is what we do now. We elect House of Representatives based on state's population, and the Senate, each state gets 2 senators, which 2 senators to represent them. So there's equal representation in the Senate, and in the House, it's based on your state's population. So the Connecticut Compromise, also known as the Great Compromise, is what we do today. So it worked. There were also some additional compromises, though, goodness, that had to be made. I don't know what is happening. Sorry, guys. All right, so you can just call this other compromises. So there were other compromises that had to be made. So southern states wanted to count slaves as part of their state population. The northern states were not for this. They were against counting slaves as part of the population because the southern states did not perceive slaves as human beings. They were perceived as livestock. So the northern states did not feel that they should be allowed to count them as part of their state's population. And they also knew that there were lots of slaves in the South and that there would be unequal representation, that would have the southern states would have a lot more population than the northern states if they were able to count their slaves as part of the population. So they came up with the 3/5 compromise. And what that means is that each slave counted. So the 3/5 compromise counted each slave as 3/5 of a person when figuring the representation in Congress. So one slave equaled 3/5 of a person. That was the compromise that they came up with at this convention. It's kind of messed up. All right, so same heading, other compromises. Again, it has to do with southern states. Southern states wanted to protect their agricultural exports and the slave trade from regulation by Congress. They didn't want Congress telling them how they exported their goods, their agricultural goods, and they did not want Congress interfering in their slave trade. So the compromise was called the Commerce and Slave Trade Compromise. So Congress could not tax state exports or interfere with the slave trade until 1808. Check back for video